Years ago, I curated an exhibition for the Norton Museum of Art in West Palm Beach, Florida, called Wheels and Heels. It was an overview of the history of Matchbox cars and Barbie dolls. The exhibition in the vast main gallery was a sort of celebration of toy design, of popular culture, of social history, of manufacturing, and all the layers of narratives that design can communicate. There were almost 1,000 toys in the hall for this exhibition. The problem for me is that the success of this exhibition has led people to believe that I care about Barbie dolls. I do not. I care about design history, and Barbie offered a really interesting tool to tell a number of stories about the history of design. And here we are in a new wave of Barbie mania brought on by this entire movie about Barbie. And everyone I know is clogging every inbox I have with plastic pink Barbie content. I can't fight it. So I decided I would jump in the fray by cleaning up this lecture and getting it properly recorded. Because Barbie has existed for such a long time and changed so dramatically over time, we have a rare opportunity. Most industrial design lives for one or maybe two generations. New designs arrive to update an object and to house a new mechanism or to use a new material. And old designs then disappear into the junk heaps and recycle bins of history. So seeing design evolution over an extended period is challenging. It becomes an apples and oranges comparison situation. Examining Barbie over time lets us chart the innovations that steadily improved the original design and kept it responding to all the new technologies, the times, and the demands of the small consumers. For centuries, the objects we made were focused on utility. The craft process is inherently iterative. If you make something and it's not quite right, you can make a next version of that something and improve it. Eventually, with change one object at a time, you get to the perfect marriage of materials and utility and form. So craft is inherently evolutionary. The Industrial Revolution arrived and separated the conception of the object from its manufacturing and created design as a new activity. This meant that designers had to predict use. There were no more do-overs. And there was a shift from the intuitive and iterative logic of the craftsman to a predictive skill of the designer. Someone like Laurel Guild was able to find success on the first try designing housewares for Alcoa in the 1930s because he had a huge collection of craft objects. He could try all the handles of all the kettles he owned and arrive at the best one for his new version of modernism. In 1940, industrial designer Walter Darwin Teague wrote about the division between design and manufacturing introduced by the Industrial Revolution. This divide between the intuitive understanding of a craftsman and the rational functioning of a mechanic. And he pointed out that design predicts use to replicate the evolution of the craft process that it was replacing. When designers are not able to predict use, problems arise. It costs a lot to manufacture something. And with safety, this is an obvious equation. When something's not made well, it can become unsafe. But there are a lot of other designs that fall into the same category of bad design merely because this predictive ability wasn't thorough enough. Chicago cutlery scissors is a good example. They come apart for ease of cleaning and sharpening, and that's a really nice feature. But when they're used by somebody with very large hands, they come apart in use, and that's not good. Designers rarely get a second chance or the opportunity to revise and improve. If a company spends a lot of money on a product that fails, they're not going to spend more money trying to fix that. They're going to move on to a new design. Barbie is a rare product that has existed throughout many iterations and technological advances, so we can see this long-term evolution happening not in a handmade object, but in something made through mass manufacturing. In today's world, software and app development is sort of always in beta mode. We accept that. If it isn't working well in this version, it will be fixed in the next. And I like to think of Barbie as a sort of 60-year beta test. Design, engineering, material innovation, and manufacturing have all advanced in real time through the creation and revision of this one toy. The back and forth between the users, children, and the designers and manufacturers, and also the back and forth between use and materials and use and manufacturing, worked as a sort of real-time modeling exercise in the design process. And that's very unusual. I have no interest in examining Barbie as a source for body image problems, or the role of women in society, or even as the problematic driver in pink becoming a girl color after many hundreds of years of pink being a boy color. There are plenty of other people doing that, and they're doing it better than I could. I'm here to offer a less academic interpretation that looks at how Barbie was made instead of at what Barbie means. My not very radical idea is that Barbies are not visionary in any way. They have never been made to steer us anywhere. They merely reflect the interests of their times. They show us what we look like in the moment. Barbie is, essentially, just a mirror. And 60 years of doing this gives us a pretty great way to look at how we have changed and consider our trajectory. For me, the really compelling story that Barbie can illustrate is the back and forth between the user, children, and designers and manufacturers. Vintage toys are full of problems that all tell stories. This is the good part of the story. Use shows psychology, and this is not visible in a new object. It's not visible in an object in a museum or beautifully photographed in a coffee table book. It is visible in the seller's images on eBay. People's personalities and behaviors are on view in the toys that they leave behind, and so are all the decisions that the designers made in the first place, and then all the evidence of their success and their failure. But let's dial it back for a moment and look at Barbie as an innovation. Barbie began as a mother's response to the inadequate toys available to her daughter. Ruth Handler's husband, Elliot, had started Mattel, and they ran it together. They had a daughter named Barbara, and Ruth was frustrated with the toys she saw Barbara playing with. The options available were not satisfactory. There were flimsy paper fashion dolls that allowed the changing of clothes and the imagining of fashion and style, but were woefully flimsy and two-dimensional. There was Build Lily, a brittle, blow-molded cellulose acetate doll from Germany that came with only her one outfit. She couldn't change clothes. She also was strung together. The parts were attached with string, so she couldn't hold a pose. And then, my least favorite category, the really disturbing hybrid dolls that have grown-up fashions, very sophisticated fashions that you could change. You could redress these dolls. And they had baby doll faces and weird prepubescent bodies. So if you've ever had the pleasure of undressing one of these dolls, you have not recovered from it. It's really disturbing and confusing. At the time, Mattel was a very successful toy company in Hawthorne, California, and there's lots we could look at with this. They had an integrated workforce. They had a seated manufacturing line, so they were able to hire disabled workers. And they were pioneers of television advertising. They changed everything about how and when toys were sold. But that's a talk for some other day. Ruth Handler wanted to use the Mattel engineering and manufacturing muscles to create this new sort of doll. She wanted a doll that would combine the fashion-changing play of paper dolls, the sophisticated look of Build Lily, and the durable construction of the Madame Alexander and Revlon dolls. So a doll that was durable and jointed, that could change clothes, that could be manipulated into a variety of poses. I think it's hard for us to remember, looking back, that this did not exist. It was a huge accomplishment. As initially designed, Barbie was all about the clothes. The first Barbie ad in March of 1959 promoted this not as a doll or a toy, but as a teen fashion model. You bought Barbie in a swimsuit, and then you bought the other outfits separately. This is a picture of the first Barbie, the doll, and the drawings of the different outfits you could get that came in a little brochure with her. I don't know who did these drawings. They're beautiful fashion illustrations, and the artist name has not been recorded anywhere that I've found. If anybody knows, chime in. And here are the actual outfits. They were designed by Charlotte Johnson, and this translation from fashion design to actual fashion was the play intent. That was the point of this doll. In 1959, a new Barbie doll was $3.99. That's about $41 today. Not cheap. And the outfits, which were sold separately, were $1.50 to $4. That's $15 to $41 today. So this was expensive toys. By 1998, Mattel had made more than 1 billion outfits. That's 1 billion with a B. Mattel became really a clothing manufacturer. By 1963, Mattel was the fourth largest clothing manufacturer in the United States. But after this first wave of Barbies found their way into use, the reality of how kids actually played with the dolls showed that this original plan had some flaws. And that original plan backfired a little bit. Mattel was so successful that they sold 300,000 Barbies in the first year. Making the actual dolls was possible, barely. But making 300,000 of these complex outfits was just not going to work in the long term. In 1959, the dolls and the clothes were all made in Japan, in an economy that was eager to find ways to continue rebuilding after the devastations of World War II. All of the snaps and labels and buttons were sewn on by hand. There was a cottage industry where batches of parts were literally delivered to workers' homes in baskets by bicycle. The Tokyo zipper manufacturer YKK created a brand new tiny zipper, they called it size 0, just for these Barbie clothes. So the clothes had to be simplified. The designers had to increase the focus on style and decrease the complexity by relaxing the exactness of the fit. And this also then made it easier to dress the dolls. The original outfits, amazing as they are quite difficult to get on and fastened. Over time, the clothes became less and less complex. They always stayed stylish, they always reflected the styles of their time, but they did so while becoming ever easier to produce. The 1970s clearly profit-based reevaluation of Barbie's closet of clothes produced some really exciting garments that started using metallics and dramatic silhouettes to convey fashion without requiring the same amount of tailoring or fussy assembly details as the clothing from the 60s. By the Superstar era in 1977, the dresses were just polyester sheaths with elastic and Velcro, eliminating all the hand-sewn snap fasteners and hook eyes and zippers. This is also called the karate chop Barbie for obvious reasons. Her bent elbows give a sort of martial arts flavor to the Barbie line. It could be argued that this was not the best of times for Barbie as a fashion icon, but balancing manufacturing costs with the ever-increasing popularity of the doll and the sheer volume that required was a real puzzle. Just FYI, the middle dress sold for $229 in 1982. That's about $7 today, and I personally think that's too much money for that trashy getup. But the biggest surprise to Mattel in the reception to the original Barbie involved her hair, and this was a major challenge. This is the original hairstyle. Larry Germain from Universal Studios designed the hair on the left, the ponytail, and a later variant on the right was created by Jean Ann Berger to swap out the poodle bangs for a sort of swoop and give Barbie a different look. This hair was sewn into the head, styled, and then glued in place. But the thin fibers made of saran, fancy name polyvinylidene chloride, which is PVDC, were sewn into the head only on the hairlines. And this explains the ponytail. The hair is gathered at the spot farthest from those rooting points. It's really the only possible hairdo for one thin layer of fibers to create something that seemed realistic. So they had to balance the least amount of sewing and the least amount of actual hair for the most amount of hairdo. And that's what led to this ponytail. But the bottom of the curl, once it was set, was glued in place to hold everything together. The problem with the original hair beautifully illustrates this need to revise and improve designs. What started out looking like this, when put into use by a brutal, demanding preteen, quickly turned into this. I'm sorry to show something so disturbing, but isn't it interesting? Every child did this to their Barbie. It is a natural, obvious desire to change her hairstyle. And when you cut that ponytail off so that you could, you discovered Barbie was something very different under the ponytail. And this was a real surprise to Mattel. They intended the play interaction to be changing the clothes. All those early clothes went on the doll from below, as if she stepped into them, the way a real lady would do with her gowns. So the hair getting messed up wasn't even part of the plan. But we all know that users never respect the plan. Children instantly identified the hair as part of what they expected to play with, and Mattel had to make some big changes fast. To offer more durability, the bubble cut was introduced. Larry Germain from Universal Studios created this hairdo, and it used thicker strands of saran, and it used much more rooting. There was no need to take on the expense of a new mold. They used the existing head and just ignored the rooting line molded into it and sewed hair on all over the place, which of course cost more, but was at the time necessary. The new hair was durable, so problem solved, right? But as always happens with design, solve one problem, make a new one. The new problem they created is that Barbie suddenly looked 50, not 17. Nevertheless, they sold 6 million of these bubble cuts in the first 4 years. Mattel then tried to youthify this doll with a new hairdo designed by Jean Berger. Also, as yet another aside, there hadn't been a lot of discussion at Mattel about who Barbie was when they were creating her. Once kids started playing with the doll, they demanded to know, who is she? How old is she? Does she have friends? Who are her parents? Mattel got all of these inquiries about who Barbie was. So they farmed these questions out to 2 writers at Random House. Cynthia Lawrence and Betty Lou Mabey produced 7, maybe 8 books about Barbie, filling in her backstory. And I have to say, I've read them all, they're really good. They're really interesting explorations of what the world expected from a teenager at the time and how Barbie might interact with that. The books are worth looking at and talking about. That's another thing for another time. For today, all we need to know is that they decided she was 17. And there's a hilarious thing about this new hairstyle. This is called the American Girl Barbie. She has a dirty little secret. The dirty little secret of the American Girl Barbie is that they used the old head mold for this new hairstyle. They just sewed the hair on in a different place, leaving the molded pathway for the original hairdo exposed. So American Girl Barbie is sort of also facelift or face replacement Barbie. And this is not in any of the books. This is empirical observation thanks to eBay. Also, when people point out that Barbie created a landscape of bad information about what a healthy female body should look like, I wonder why no one ever mentions this inscrutable, impossible profile. Mattel finally got durable, playable hair and a youthful look balanced with cost, but it took 10 years of trying. They could now sell her with a hairbrush and really satisfy the kids who wanted to play with her hair. At this point, she also got rooted eyelashes. There had been these weird bumps of plastic painted black that functioned as her eyelashes, and at this point she gets actual hair eyelashes, which are just differently creepy. At some point in the 1980s, Barbie's hair switched from being made of saran fibers to being nylon. But the real power hair era began in the 1990s with the introduction of Kanekalon, a polystyrene fiber that was manufactured by a Japanese company, Kaneka. It was first developed in 1957, and then Kanekalon transformed the wig industry from the late 60s through the 1970s, and interestingly, that happened in Korea, where Korean manufacturers were using this Japanese fiber to make wigs for an American market. Hairplay, one of the biggest oversights in the original design, was incrementally enabled and improved over the decades. It's hard to argue that this is not the ultimate triumph in that battle. Matching dolls and dogs designed specifically for maximum hairplay excitement. Why not share your hairbrush with your dog? But honestly, I prefer the inevitable outcome, the end product mess of anything this optimistic about children and hair care. Also, just FYI, poor Ken, they gave him combable hair to match. It didn't really help him much. Another fascinating back and forth involves Barbie's limbs. Early dolls had solid vinyl limbs, not hollow ones. And this was a real manufacturing feat. World War II made us investigate uses for new plastics, but we hadn't yet really mastered them, or discovered how to repurpose the technology for peacetime use. To get the plastic to go all the way out to the fingers and toes, the molds were rotated during the casting process. And this led to a lovely, detailed, paintable, mani-pedi landscape for Barbie. To help explain this process, here's a movie. This is head making, so the rotation makes the head hollow and also guarantees all the details. But it's the same process that's used for solid limbs. And the factory in Japan that was making the dolls had to fabricate their equipment to do this based on an American Plastic magazine description of how the process would work. That's how new this technique still was. One problem with these solid limbs which identifies these Barbies as straight-leg dolls, is that they can't sit down, which is all the more hilarious because Mattel very quickly started making houses and furniture for Barbie, and if you could get her to stay on them, she didn't look especially comfortable. Finally, after years of work, Mattel introduced the new bending knee. It was imagined by engineer Dick May and then patented here by the head of research and development, Jack Ryan. It used an interior mechanism housed in a hollow, flexible leg. And anyone who had these remembers the very distinct clicking sound of the two plastic parts as they rotated against each other into the multiple knee positions. And also then the skeleton poking out of a tiny disturbing expansion hole in the bottom of the foot. This picture shows what was happening inside and what produced that sound. The bending knee greatly increased Barbie's range of motion, and so then also, as a result, the way kids could play with her. So this straight leg that could only swing up and down could suddenly turn into a way more exciting bending knee leg. This huge advance solved some problems. Barbie could, after 6 years, finally sit down. And she could look like she was really walking. But then when you get that brand new exciting success into children's hands, they quickly identify the new problems that those designers had introduced without knowing. One problem was just an aesthetic one. The lovely molded toes with the painted nails from the straight leg era, when translated into soft flexible plastic, became crude slashes just suggesting toes, but not very elegant. And there was no more toenail polish because it wouldn't stick as well to that softer flexible plastic. Another problem introduced by the bending knee involved the shoes. The soft plastic toes were difficult or almost impossible to fit all the way into the already iconic Barbie open-toed shoe. If you got the foot in, it was just a matter of time before the compressed toes shot the shoe off across the room into oblivion. So Mattel had to design new closed-toe and closed-heel shoes that would stay on these new feet. And molds are expensive, even tiny shoe molds, or especially tiny shoe molds. But the real revelation was soft plastic is really fun to chew. Almost every vintage bending knee doll you can find is somehow scarred by the over-curious teeth of a small child. And children are never satisfied. Even with the knees, there are just not that many ways to pose these dolls. As manufacturing in plastics became a more confident exercise, there was more room to challenge the progress and make more complex parts and add more movement. Also, Jack Ryan was an engineering marvel. He was responsible for so many toy innovations at Mattel, probably all dreamed up at his legendary pool parties. He deserves his own lecture. He's not going to get one today. I'll just tell you that he was an engineer at Raytheon, he spent 20 years at Mattel, and he was Zsa Zsa Gabor's 6th husband. This is his patent for the next attempt to get Barbie moving in more ways and more lifelike ways using the available plastics and molding. The genius of this design is so simple. Jack Ryan took the solid torso of the early Barbies and introduced a rotating joint at the waist. But he didn't just introduce a rotating waist, not a horizontal joint. He angled that joint ever so slightly. And that angle created exciting poses. Barbie seemed to be always in motion, even when static. And this perfectly matched the attitudes and dances of the 1960s mod era. Another problem with the straight leg relates to Barbie's overall figure. In order to get the solid leg to lock into the torso and rotate on its plunger joint, she needed to have really wide hips. There was a minimum width that she could be at the hips. And you can make a 1/6 scale, 11.5-inch doll, but you can't scale the fabric from our real world looms down to that scale. You can't make fabric any thinner. The earliest Barbie outfits could have in excess of 12 layers of fabric at the waist. So reducing the size of the waist allowed her dressed hip to waist proportions to look okay, while her naked proportions went kind of bonkers. And then, since Mattel had sold hundreds of thousands of these dolls, and many more of the outfits in just the first few years, they were sort of trapped. Changing Barbie's body meant that none of those clothes would fit the new doll. This crazy body shape was, from a practical perspective, now unchangeable. This also limited Mattel's ability to expand the line of dolls. When it became clear that children wanted other characters to expand their play scenarios, they added Ken and Alan and Midge. But what they did with Midge, Barbie's best friend, was just use the exact same doll body and slap a new head on it so that they could share all their clothing. By the way, the fifth model of Barbie, introduced in 1961, had a pretty interesting technical problem. Waldo Seaman was a chemist at B.F. Goodrich, and he turned vinyl chloride into polyvinyl chloride, what we call PVC. It's everywhere in our world. It was a new material in the 20s, and during World War II, it really got used a lot and perfected. Barbie is made of PVC, and Barbie is a huge part of how manufacturing with PVC was advanced and perfected and investigated. How it could be used solid or hollow molded, and how it could be made rigid or flexible by adjusting the different additives. This generation of Barbie, Barbie number 5, used a slightly different mixture of plastic, which led to a long-term release of the added plasticizer, creating a sweaty face. So the face has to be a softer plastic because it's rotationally molded and soft. And in this case, there was too much soft, and that has leaked out and can't be stopped. If we just skip ahead to today, all of the precision that computer-assisted design and computer-assisted manufacturing allow, all of the decades of experience with plastic manufacturing, all of the new polymers, allow joints and attachments that could never have been part of the Barbie manufacturing landscape in the early decades of the doll. They are astounding engineering feats. Also, the complexity of these joints allows designers far more flexibility in creating body shapes we want instead of the ones that they're just stuck with. This Ken on the left is another funny story for another time. His hair was flocked. It was glued on fuzz, which all rubbed off. And so I call this hair loss Ken. Although the outside of a doll might seem unchanged over time, boy, has what's been going on inside unrecognizably improved. Instead of merely being able to rotate her head a little left to right, the modern head attachment allows movement in almost every direction at almost every angle. Barbie now has better neck mobility than I do. And look at that shoulder joint. The miniaturization of human movement and the remarkable ways that Mattel engineers have invented to capture that in rigid plastic is really amazing. Their innovations then spread out into lots of other industries, allowing better manufacturing of other plastic goods. Critics of Barbie's body as a bad model for children have lots to be upset about, for sure. But the engineering and manufacturing were, until relatively recently, extreme limitations. And to get plastic to allow the movement that children expected naturally led to some pretty funky shapes. Also, giving up on the idea that dolls need to have shareable clothes required undoing a lot of other things. In fact, it required giving up on the entire original plan for what Barbie was. So let's get back to the development of that story. Mattel sort of got to the next big chapter by accident. One component of this change was a series of 9 dresses for Barbie designed by Oscar de la Renta, starting in 1984. And they found success with adult collectors, which made Mattel realize there were other consumers out there to capture. This led to an entire series of designer-created Barbies. There have been many, many of them. I tried to find a count. It's somewhere around 100. Every designer out there has lobbied Mattel to get involved and design their own Barbie. Just FYI, the best, by far, are by Byron Lars. I think that's irrefutable. Another aspect of this same revelation started way back in 1964 with the introduction of 5 outfits representing traditional costumes from different countries. The kimono on the right is so beautifully made. It's really amazing. And I think that's partly because they were still being made in Japan in 1964, and so there was just a lot of love thrown at this miniature representation of their own culture. At this point, it was just the outfits, and children put them on their existing dolls. But by the 1980s, the challenges of manufacturing the plastic doll had really been conquered. The clothing had become less precious, less complex, less difficult to manufacture, and as a result, a smaller part of the system. When the audience expanded from children who wanted to swap the clothing to include adult collectors who just stuck the doll on a shelf and often never took it out of the box, Mattel realized that they should change their original Barbie plan. The doll purchased in a bathing suit went away. The fully dressed theme doll arrived. What became a series called Dolls of the World started small in 1979 with some obvious choices, but eventually conquered most of the world. There have been well over 100 dolls in this series, and at first the clothing was still removable, so theoretically these dolls could find their way into a toy chest with other Barbies and other outfits. But as the Dolls of the World series succeeded and developed, many outfits were sewn right onto the doll, not even removable anymore. Some dolls even have white plastic legs, so they didn't have to bother putting stockings on them. The expansion of Barbie to be both toy and collectible was tremendously successful. Dolls of the World grew to include other series like the Great Eras and the Princesses of the World. In the beginning, it was just too expensive to easily alter the actual shapes of Barbie's body or face because the molds were so expensive to make. Mattel relied on using tinted plastic to suggest a different skin tone and altering the makeup printing to allow the illusion of different ethnicities or geographies. With the arrival of computer-assisted design and manufacturing, though, mold prices were so decreased that the idea of making a unique mold for a doll became a reality. This is when Dolls of the World shifted from being mildly abstract to being very specific. I leave it to you to decide where this sits on the racism scale, because it's clearly very complicated and has changed a lot over time. My argument is it changed because manufacturing allowed it to, and I think it improved as a result. The two types of Barbies, collectibles and toys, sort of merged to create an endless string of career Barbies. These are meant to inspire children to consider different professions and to see women in all of those professions, but it's also meant to tempt adults into buying them all as a collection. Barbie had astronaut outfits in 1965, and again in a much less realistic way in 1985. But through the 1990s, she came fully professionalized in every possible career. And Mattel continued to find ways of satisfying or maybe exploiting the adult collectors. The success of all the collector dolls led to the creation of an entirely other sort of Barbie. This is called the Silkstone collection, and it celebrates Barbie's more refined original form. It's a solid plastic doll, not hollow, and it replicates the weight and solidity of that original 1959 doll. It has a more exaggerated head shape and much more severe makeup, total side-eye Barbie. Much more like the original doll. And scandalously, it has a far more exaggerated figure, much smaller waist. As the world was demanding that toy Barbies work harder to represent realistic bodies and to offer a more diverse range of identities, collectors were actually clamoring for the exact opposite. And the clothing in the Silkstone line returns to the unbelievable complexity of the original 1959 fashions. And that's why these cost $100 and more. There are so many more ways we could look at this never-ending Barbie beta evolution. I'm just going to throw a couple more at you. I think the evolution of the eye painting is fascinating. In the early dolls, the eyes were painted using stencils and spray paint, a different stencil for every color. The detail was very difficult to achieve, the colors were limited, the stencils clogged all the time. And then the makeup progressed to being transfer printing. So ink was printed on a flexible surface, and that was pressed onto the three-dimensional shape of the face, allowing more detail and cleaner edges. And then finally, the technique advanced to being applied decals, and that now allows the flexibility of endless alterations of eye color, of eye shape, without requiring new mold making. The Barbie face has become more and more generic, less contoured, less three-dimensional really, to allow easier application of these details, which now define the face more than the molded contour. And this is part of what allows the current diversification of the character, partly intent, partly marketing, but largely technology. It would also be fun to examine the astounding complexity of the early menswear. The tailoring on these is really remarkable, but we don't have time for that today. I probably should include some information about the pioneer of consumer research, Ernest Dichter. His Institute for Motivational Research was hired in 1958 when the doll was ready to go to market to analyze people's responses to the doll and propose an advertising path that took advantage of the findings. So this was a marketing exercise after the design was complete. And he stressed something he called maintaining psychoeconomic equilibrium. To temper the anticipated resistance of mothers to a doll that was perceived as sexy, Dichter proposed focusing on Barbie as a tool for teaching young girls about grooming and manners, turning them into ladies. So Barbie was to become an educational tool. And this led to an increase in the quantity of accessories. Most of what critics object to about Barbie was actually layered onto her and into the marketing of her by Dichter after she was already fully formed. So it's sort of all his fault, but also more tiny gloves. I'm including this just because I keep hearing about Barbie's scale in news reports. Barbie's all over the news and everyone brings up her scale permanently fixed at 110 pounds. It came as part of 1965's Slumber Party Barbie, and it came with a little book on how to lose weight that on the back just says, "Don't eat." It's being held up today as evidence of all the evils of the Barbie industrial psychological complex. But I want to point out that if you Google the healthy weight for a 17-year-old today, Google says 118 pounds. And there is more information about intermittent fasting as one of the hottest diet trends of 2023. So as with everything else, I have to wonder, do we blame Mattel for this? Do we blame Barbie for this? Or do we blame ourselves? We created the monster in this mirror. I, predictably, am far more interested in the specific brand of bathroom scale that might have inspired this miniature. It's easy to look back over decades of success, business, design, manufacturing, and marketing success, and romanticize the objects that produce that success. It's common to ignore the evolutionary aspect of these toys and focus instead on the influence they've had over the development of children. Body dysmorphia, gender, racial divides, it's all there. But we're looking back over the whole trajectory and forgetting that each moment was a reaction to that moment. We can only understand it as a narrative in the rearview mirror. In the case of successful toy lines, and especially Barbie, actual finished goods can be considered a sort of modeling tool, used to advance design while also lubricating the gears of commerce. And each change in that design is a reaction to a miscalculation, an engineering failure, some new technology, a new material. And it works in the same way that multiple generations of iterations used to in the pre-industrial craft-based world. Manufactured items align objects with their era's materials and manufacturing and techniques. They consider users' needs and expectations. And this is understood to be true for medical equipment, for automobiles, for electronics, but it is also true, amazingly, for Barbie dolls. I hope that information was interesting. I also hope it explains why, even though I'm willing to put on a pink jacket for this, I don't care about the movie. I would just rather watch movies about rotational molding and hair rooting. These are the original drawings that came in the first little Barbie catalog. You can take the boy out of the pandemic, but you can't get the motorcycles out of the soundtrack. Oh God. Okay. I mean, geez. I can't believe I'm talking about this.